Speaking of war, you wrote a book on Henry Kissinger. It's not a great transition, but it made sense in my head. Who was Henry Kissinger as a man and as a historical figure?
So Henry Kissinger to me is one of the most fascinating figures in history because he comes to the United States as a German Jewish immigrant at age 15, speaking no English. And within a few years, he's a major figure influencing U.S. foreign policy at the height of U.S. power. But while he's doing that, he's never elected to office. And he's constantly reviled by people, including people who are anti-Semitic because he's Jewish. But at the same time, also, his exoticism makes him more attractive to people. So someone like Nelson Rockefeller wants Kissinger around. He's one of Kissinger's first patrons because he wants a really smart Jew. And Kissinger's going to be that smart Jew. I call Kissinger a policy Jew. There were these court Jews in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries in Europe. Every king wanted the Jew to manage his banking. And in a sense, in the United States, in the second half of the 20th century, many presidents want a Jew to manage their international affairs. And what does that really mean? It's not just about being Jewish. Yeah. It's the internationalism. It's the cosmopolitanism. And that's one of the things I was fascinated with Kissinger. Someone like Kissinger is unthinkable as a powerful figure in the United States 30 or 40 years earlier because the United States is run by WASPs. It's run by white elites who come from a certain background. Kissinger represents a moment when American society opens up, not to everyone, but opens up to these cosmopolitan figures who have language skills, historical knowledge, networks that can be used for the U.S. government when, after World War II, we have to rebuild Europe, when we have to negotiate with the Soviet Union, when we need the kinds of knowledge we didn't have before. And Harvard, where he gets his education late, he started at City College, actually, but Harvard, where he gets his education late, is at the center of what's happening at all these major universities, at Harvard, at Yale, at Stanford, at the University of Texas, everywhere, where they're growing in their international affairs, bringing in the kinds of people who never would be at the university before, training them, and then enlisting them in Cold War activities. And so Kissinger is a representative of that phenomenon. I became interested in him because I think he's a bellwether. He shows how power has changed in the United States.
So he enters this whole world of politics, post-World War II in the 50s?
Yes. So he actually, in the 40s even, it's an extraordinary story. He comes to the United States in 1938, just before Kristallnacht. His family leaves. He actually grew up right outside of Nuremberg. They leave right before Kristallnacht in fall of 38. Come to New York. He originally works in a brush factory cleaning brushes, goes to a public high school. And in 1942, just after Pearl Harbor, he joins the military. And he's very quickly in the military, first of all, given citizenship, which he didn't have before. He's sent for the first time outside of a kosher home. He had been in a kosher home his entire life. He's sent to South Carolina to eat ham for Uncle Sam. And nice. Then he is, and this is extraordinary, at the age of 20, barely speaking English, he is sent back to Germany with the U.S. Army in an elite counterintelligence role. Why? Wow. Because they need German speakers. He came when he was 15, so he actually understands the society. They need people who have that cultural knowledge. Mm-hmm. And because he's Jewish, they can trust that he'll be anti-Nazi. And there's a whole group of these figures. He's one of many. And so he's in an elite circle. He's discriminated against in New York. When he goes to Harvard after that, he can only live in a Jewish-only dorm. But at the same time, he's in an elite policy role in counterintelligence. He forms a network there that stays with him the rest of his career. There's a gentleman named Fritz Kramer who becomes a sponsor of his in the emerging Pentagon Defense Department world. And as early as the early 1950s, he's sent then to Korea to comment on affairs in Korea. He becomes both an intellectual recognized for his connections, but also someone who policymakers want to talk about. His book on nuclear weapons, when it's written, is given to President Eisenhower to read, because they say this is someone writing interesting things. You should read what he says.
There's a certain aspect to him that's kind of like Forrest Gump. He seems to continuously be the right person at the right time in the right place.
That's right.
Somehow finding him in this. I don't understand. You can only get lucky so many times because he continues to get lucky in terms of being at the right place in history for many decades until today.
Yeah, well, he has a knack for that. I spent a lot of time talking with him, and what comes through very quickly is that he has an eye for power. It's, I think, unhealthy. He's obsessed with power.
Can you explain, like, an observer of power,
Yes.
or being? Does he want power himself?
Yes, both of those things. Both of those. And I think I explain this in the book. He doesn't agree with what I'm going to say now, but I think I'm right, and I think he's right. I think it's very hard to analyze yourself, right?
Yeah.
I think he develops an obsession with gaining power because he sees what happens when you have no power. He experiences the trauma. His father is a very respected Gymnasiumlehrer in Germany. Even though he's Jewish, he's actually the teacher of German classics to the German kids.
This is great.
And he's forced to flee, and he becomes nothing. His father never really makes a way for himself in the United States. He becomes a postal delivery person, which is nothing wrong with that. But for someone who's a respected teacher in Germany, and Gymnasiumlehrer are like professors there, right? To then be in this position, his mother has to open a catering business when they come to New York. It's a typical immigrant story, but he sees the trauma. His grandparents are killed by the Nazis. So he sees the trauma, and he realizes how perilous it is to be without power.
And you're saying he does not want to acknowledge the effect of that.
It's hard. It's hard. I mean, most of us, if we've had trauma, it's believable that it's traumatic because you don't talk about it. I have a friend who interviews combat veterans, and he says, as soon as someone freely wants to tell me about their combat trauma, I suspect that they're not telling me the truth. If it's traumatic, it's hard to talk about.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder how much from my own life, everything that I've ever done is just the result of the complicated relationship with my father. I had a really difficult time. I did a podcast conversation with him.
I saw it, actually. Yeah, it's great. It was. I was
regret
thinking I could
everything.
never do that with my father.
But I remember as I was doing it, and for months after, I regretted doing it. I just kept regretting it, and the fact that I was regretting it spoke to the fact that I'm running away from some truths that are back there somewhere. And that's perhaps what Kissinger is as well. But is there? I mean, he's been a part of so many interesting moments of American history, of world history, from the Cold War, Vietnam War, until today. What stands out to you as a particularly important moment in his career that made who he is?
Well, I think what made his career in many ways was his experience in the 1950s building a network of people across the world who were rising leaders from unique positions. He ran what he called the International Seminar at Harvard, which was actually a summer school class that no one at Harvard cared about. But he invited all of these rising intellectuals and thinkers from around the world, and he built a network there that he used forevermore. So that's what really, I think, boosts him. The most important moments in terms of making his reputation and making his career are two sets of activities. One is the opening to China, and his ability to, first of all, take control of U.S. policy without the authority to do that and direct U.S. policy, and then build a relationship with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai that was unthinkable just 4 or 5 years earlier. Of course, President Nixon is a big part of that as well, but Kissinger is the mover and shaker on that, and it's a lot of manipulation, but it's also a vision.
Now, this is in the moment of American history where there's a very powerful anti-communism.
Correct.
So communism is seen as much more, even than today, as the enemy.
Correct. And China in particular, they were one of our key enemies in Vietnam. And in Korea, American forces were fighting Chinese forces directly. Chinese forces come over the border. Thousands of Americans die at the hand of Chinese forces, right? So for a long time, the United States had no relationship with communist China. He opens that relationship. And at the same time, he also creates a whole new dynamic in the Middle East. After the 1973 war, the so-called Yom Kippur War, he steps in and becomes the leading negotiator between the Israelis, the Egyptians, and other major actors in the region. And it makes the United States the most powerful actor in the Middle East, the Soviet Union far less powerful, which is great for the United States in the 70s and 80s. It gets us, though, into the problems we, of course, have thereafter.
So that speaks to the very pragmatic approach that he's taken The realistic approach versus the idealistic approach, termed realpolitik. What is this thing? What is this approach to world politics?
So realpolitik for Kissinger is really focusing on the power centers in the world and trying as best you can to manipulate those power centers to serve the interests of your own country. And so that's why he's a multilateralist. He's not a unilateralist. He believes the United States should put itself at the center of negotiations between other powerful countries. But that's also why he pays very little attention to countries that are less powerful. And this is why he's often criticized by human rights activists. For him, parts of Africa and Latin America, which you and I would consider important places, are unimportant because they don't have power. They can't project their power. They don't produce a lot of economic wealth. And so they matter less. Realpolitik views the world in a hierarchy of power.
How does realpolitik realize itself in the world? What does that really mean? Like, how do you push forward the interests of your own country? You said there's power centers, but it is a big, bold move to negotiate, to work with a communist nation, with your enemies that are powerful. What is the sort of, if you can further elaborate the philosophy behind it?
Sure. So there are two key elements that then end up producing all kinds of tactics, but the two strategic elements of Kissinger's way of thinking about realpolitik, which are classical ways, going back to Thucydides and the Greeks, are to say, first of all, you figure out who your allies are, and you build webs of connection so that your allies help you to acquire what you want to acquire. Right. This is why, according to Herodotus, the Greeks beat the Persians. The Persians are bigger, but the Greeks, the Spartans, the Athenians, others are able to work together and leverage their resources, right? So it's about leveraging your resources. For Kissinger, this makes Western Europe crucially important. It makes Japan crucially important. It makes Israel and Egypt crucially important, right? In building these webs, you build your surrogates, you build your brother states. In other parts of the world, you build tight connections and you work together to control the resources that you want. The second element of the strategy is not to go to war with your adversary, but to do all you can to limit the power of your adversary. Some of that is containment, preventing the Soviet Union from expanding. That was the key element of American Cold War policy. But sometimes it's actually negotiation. That's what détente was about for Kissinger. He spends a lot of time, more time than any other American foreign policymaker, negotiating with Soviet leaders as well as Chinese leaders. What does he want to do? He wants to limit the nuclear arms race. The United States is ahead. We don't want the Soviet Union to get ahead of us. We negotiate to limit their abilities, right? We play to our strengths. So it's a combination of keeping your adversary down and building tight webs. Within that context, military force is used. But you're not using war for the sake of war. Mm-hmm. You're using warfare to further your access to the resources, economic, political, geographic, that you want.
To build relationships, and then the second thing, to limit the powers of those you're against.
Exactly.
So is there any sort of insights into how he preferred to build relationships? Are we talking about, like, again, it's the one-on-one? Is it through policy, or is it through, like, phone conversations? Is there any cool kind of insights that you could speak to?
Yeah, Kissinger is the ultimate kiss-up. He is. Some used to make fun of him. In fact, even the filmmaker for Dr. Strangelove, whose name I'm forgetting, right, Stanley Kubrick, called him kiss-up at times. Right? He had a wonderful way of figuring out what it is you wanted, back to that discussion we had before, and trying to show how he could give you more of what you wanted as a leader. It was very personalistic. And he spends a lot of time, for example, kissing up to Leonid Brezhnev, kissing up to Mao. He tells Mao, "You're the greatest leader in the history of the 20th century. People will look back on you as the great leader." Some of this sounds like BS, but it's serious, right? He's feeding the egos of those around him. Second, he is willing to get things done for you. He's effective. You want him around you because of his efficacy. So Richard Nixon is always suspicious that Henry Kissinger is getting more of the limelight. He hates that Kissinger gets the Nobel Peace Prize and he doesn't, but he needs him because Kissinger is the guy who gets things done. So he performs. He builds a relationship in almost, I say this in the book, in almost a gangster way. He didn't like that. He criticized that part of the book. But again, I still think the evidence is there You need something to be done, boss? I'll do it. And don't forget that I'm doing this for you. And you get mutual dependency in a Hegelian way, right?
Yeah.
And so he builds this personal dependency through ego and through performance. And then he's so skillful at making decisions for people who are more powerful, because he's never elected to office. He always needs powerful people to let him do things. But he convinces you it's your decision when it's really his. To read his memos are beautiful. He's actually very skilled at writing things in a way that looks like he's giving you options as president, but in fact, there's only one option there.
Is he, speaking to the gangster, to the loyalty, is he ever, like the sense I got from Nixon is Nixon would backstab you if he needed to. One of the things that I admire about gangsters is they don't backstab those in the inner circle, like loyalty above all else. I mean, at least that's the sense I've gotten from the stories of the past, at least. Is where would you put Kissinger on that? Is he loyalty above all else? Or is it, or a human, it's like the Steve Jobs thing, is like, as long as you're useful, but then the moment you're no longer useful is when you're knocked off the chessboard.
It's the latter with him. He's backstabbing quite a lot, and he's self-serving, but he also makes himself so useful that even though Nixon knows he's doing that, Nixon still needs him.
Yeah. By the way, on that point, so having spoken with Kissinger, what's your relationship like with him as somebody who is, in an objective way, writing his story?
It was very difficult because he's very good at manipulating people, and we had about 12 or 13 interviews, usually informal over lunch, and this was many years ago. But this is probably not more than 10 years ago.
Did you find yourself being like sweet talked, like to where you like go back home later and look in the mirror and it's like, wait, what just happened?
He can be enormously charming and enormously obnoxious at the same time. So I would have these very mixed emotions because he gives no ground. He's unwilling to, and I think this is a weakness, he's unwilling to admit mistake. Others make mistakes, but he doesn't. And he certainly won't take on any of the big criticisms that are pushed. I understand why. I mean, when you've worked as hard for what he has as he has, you're defensive about it. But he is very defensive. He's very fragile about it. He does not like criticisms at all. He used to, he hasn't done this in a while, but he used to call me up and yell at me on the phone, quite literally, when I would be quoted in the New York Times or somewhere saying something that sounded critical of him. So, for instance, there was one instance a number of years ago where a reporter came across some documents where Kissinger said negative things about Jews in Russia, typical things that a German Jew would say about East European Jews. And the New York Times asked me, is this accurate? And I said, yeah, the documents are accurate. I've seen them. They're accurate. He was so angry about that. So there's the fragility, but there's also the enormous charm and the enormous intelligence. The real challenge with him, though, is he's very good at making his case. He'll convince you. And as a scholar, as an observer, you don't want to hear a lawyer's case. You want to actually interrogate the evidence and get to the truth. Mm-hmm. And so that was a real challenge with him.
So speaking of his approach of realpolitik, if we just zoom out and look at human history, human civilization, what do you think works best in the way we progress forward? A realistic approach, do whatever it takes, control the centers of power, to play a game for the greater interests of the good guys, quote unquote, or lead by a sort of idealism, which is like truly act in the best version of the ideas you represent, as opposed to kind of present one view and then do whatever it takes and behind the scenes.
Obviously, you need some of both, but I lean more to the idealistic side, and more so, actually, believe it or not, as I get into my 40s, as I do more historical work. Why do I say that? Because I think, and this is one of my criticisms of Kissinger, who I also have a lot of respect for, the realpolitik becomes self-defeating because you're constantly running to keep power, but you forget why. And you often then use power, and I think Kissinger falls into this in some of his worst moments, not all of his moments, where the power is actually being used to undermine the things you care about. It's sort of the example of being a parent, and you're doing all these things to, take your kid to violin, basketball, all these things, and you realize you're actually killing your kid and making your kid very unhappy. And the whole reason you were doing it was to improve the person's life.
Yeah.
And so you have to remember why it is. What Hans Morgenthau calls this is your purpose. Your purpose has to drive you. Now, your purpose doesn't have to be airy-fairy idealism. So I believe deeply in democracy as an ideal. I don't think it's going to ever look like Athenian democracy, but that should drive our policy. But we still have to be realistic and recognize we're not going to build that democracy in Afghanistan tomorrow.
I mean, does it ultimately just boil down again to the corrupting nature of power, that nobody can hold power for very long before you start acting in the interest of power as opposed to in the interest of your ideals? It's impossible to be like somebody like Kissinger, who is essentially in power for many, many decades, and still remember what are the initial ideals that you strove to achieve.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. There's a moment in the book I quote about him, comes from one of our interviews. I asked him, what were the guiding ideals for your policies? And he said, I'm not prepared to share that. And I don't think it's because he doesn't know what he thinks he was trying to do. He realizes his use of power departed quite a lot from.
So it would sound, if he made them explicit, it would sound hypocritical.
Correct.